Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into week 28, why organizations no longer see the relationships that create value. Whenever we sit down in boardrooms to talk about operational resilience, we almost always start with this really comforting exercise, taking an inventory. And hey, it's a totally natural starting point for executives. But as we're going to see, it's also exactly where our biggest blind spots begin.
Think about what that inventory usually looks like. It is remarkably standard across almost every industry out there. We list our traditional IT assets, right? Applications, servers, cloud platforms, networks, backups, suppliers, and data centers. This is the traditional way of viewing resilience, essentially as a catalog of owned technical assets. Now, while that's highly useful, these inventories all share the exact same limitation.
And that limitation is this. These lists describe what we own, but they rarely explain how we actually work. And that distinction is absolutely crucial. See, an organization doesn't create value just because its assets exist. A state-of-the-art server sitting quietly in a data center doesn't do anything on its own. Value gets created because those assets continuously interact with your people, with critical decisions, flowing information, and daily business activities. So resilience depends far less on individual components and far more on the relationships between them.
Section 1. How value is actually created.
To see how this plays out in the real world, let's just deconstruct a standard business workflow to find out where value truly originates. Think about a routine customer order. At first glance, the order seems to glide through a neat, linear set of applications. It starts in your CRM, moves over to the ERP, goes down to warehouse management for picking, gets handed off to a transportation platform, and finally ends up in an invoicing system. It looks perfectly clean, right? Purely technical. But as leaders, we know this surface-level view is a bit of a dangerous illusion.
Because right underneath that simple 5-step workflow lies a deeply complex and often entirely undocumented web of invisible dependencies. Beneath those clean application handoffs, we're relying on manual business approvals, strict data quality, rapid operational decisions, supplier commitments, and highly specific human expertise. Literally every single one of these elements represents a critical operational dependency. Which brings us to a really profound insight from the source material. The application itself does not create value. The infrastructure doesn't create value. Even your data, on its own, does not create value. Value only emerges when all of these underlying relationships work together seamlessly. Look at it this way. If the human expertise isn't there to make a key operational decision, well, the best ERP system in the world is not going to get that product out the door.
And this brings us to a fundamental paradigm shift away from just protecting isolated assets, known as the Ransom-Kick Resilience Model. This model states that operational resilience is about understanding and preserving the relationships that allow the organization to continue operating. It shifts our entire focus from looking at technical components in total isolation to actively managing the vital glue that holds your entire business together.
For decades, resilience programs were practically obsessed with technology. We asked things like, which server should we restore first, or which backup strategy should we adopt? Now, those are essential questions, absolutely, but they are no longer sufficient. Why? Because modern organizations have evolved into massive, intertwined ecosystems. Your cloud services rely heavily on external providers. Your business processes depend on globally distributed teams. Critical decisions are tied to specialized knowledge, and applications rely on shared data. Basically, every capability you have depends on dozens of relationships that almost never show up on a traditional asset list.
Section 2. When crises expose reality.
So, what happens when this intricate ecosystem is suddenly put under pressure? The gap between simply owning assets and actually understanding relationships becomes incredibly costly. When a major crisis hits, it often feels totally unpredictable. But the reality is, a crisis doesn't invent new dependencies. It just exposes the fragile, invisible ones that were already there. All of a sudden, you're faced with a missing approval, an unavailable specialist, or some forgotten supplier. They didn't just appear. The crisis simply forced you to finally look at them.
This realization demands a total shift in how we think. Instead of constantly asking, what systems should we protect, leaders need to pause and ask a much more fundamental question. What relationships make our business capable of creating value? Answering this leads to a completely different and, frankly, much more effective understanding of your organization's true operational resilience. Because resilience starts with the business transformation, not the technical component.
Section 3. A new era of governance.
To really lock this concept in, imagine a thought experiment with two completely different organizations using the exact same technology. the same cloud provider, identical cybersecurity, the exact same infrastructure. Now, if they both face the exact same crisis, why does one recover quickly while the other remains totally paralyzed for weeks? Because technology was never the differentiator. One organization knew exactly how value was created through its relationships. The other organization only knew where its systems were located. If just one essential relationship disappears, an entire activity stops completely, even if every single server in your data center has a green light.
So the real takeaway here is that modern governance is no longer just about supervising applications, it's about supervising relationships. It means really understanding which dependencies actually matter to your value creation, knowing which ones are fragile, identifying exactly where you need to make targeted investments, testing them, improving them, and crucially, making them visible well before a crisis has the chance to expose them. That is what true proactive management looks like today.
Section 4. Continuing the conversation. To summarize the core takeaway of this explainer, true complexity doesn't come from the applications you own, but from the invisible relationships required to transform them into value. If you want to truly understand what enables an organization to continue creating value under pressure, I highly encourage you to discover the Ransom-Kick Resilience Model. You can explore the framework and methodology designed by Fabian Polisoid, who is the founder of Ransom-Kick, the designer of the Ransom-Kick Resilience Model, and author of the Ensuring Operational Resilience book series by visiting www.ransomkick.com.
And for a practical application of these exact concepts, you should definitely explore Archimonesians at www.archimonesians.app. It's a dedicated operational resilience structuring and governance environment designed specifically to help you map, test, and make those invisible relationships totally visible across your entire organization.
Also, to continue the conversation, be sure to subscribe to the Archeon Group YouTube channel. And for audio listeners, I highly recommend checking out our English podcast, Ransom-Kick Resilience Talks, or our French podcast, Conversations Resilience Ransom-Kick. Both of these are fantastic, in-depth resources designed to deepen your understanding of modern operational governance.
I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought right from the source material. A dependency never exists alone. It is always part of a larger dependency chain. I want you to think about that in the context of your own organization today, because next time we're going to dive into exactly how these chains form operational bottlenecks and how they become the very foundation for resilience decision-making. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the right questions about your relationships, and I'll see you in the next one.